My name is Deidre T. Garden. I'm the Executive Director here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center on Maui, where our mission is to inspire people to find the hero within themselves through the legacy of our Nisei veterans. And you can find out more information about our center on the web at nvmc.org. We're so thrilled that you're with us for an afternoon with the author, where we invite authors from across the state and nation to come on and talk to us a little bit more about the backstory and the journey to their books. We're thrilled to have all of you today join us for this talk with Scott Kikkawa, the author of Kona Winds. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. As always, we love to take your questions, and you can send in your questions as you're thinking about them via that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen. We will get to as many as time allows. Secondly, as you just heard, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel in about a week. So we invite you to go on there and check out this and other talks and share them with your family and friends. And of course, we couldn't do what we do without all of our supporters, including our corporate donors. You saw their logos as you were getting on to the Zoom call today. So we thank all of them. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Scott Kikkawa. Scott Kikkawa is a Yonsei product of Hawaii Kai on Oahu, where the only local culture was Yik Lung commercials and kikaida on the zenith in the family room. By day, he is a federal law enforcement officer, and by night, he prays for early retirement and writes detective noir stories set in a Honolulu where cops still wore coats, ties, and hats, and Kaka'ako was a Japanese ghetto. He lives in Honolulu with his family. Please help me give a very warm virtual Maui welcome to Mr. Scott Kikkawa. Scott, how are you?
Hi, Deidre. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We can
Okay.
hear you and we can see you, and we thank you so much for coming on this afternoon. I just got to say, I love your book. And when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a detective. So Nancy Drew was my role model. But I had so much fun reading this book and can't wait to talk to you about it today. So I just kind of want to start off with a little bit more information about your background and your connection to the whole Nisei story during World War II. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. In my immediate family, we didn't really have somebody that served because we were off by about a half generation. My father was born in 1936, which meant at the time Pearl Harbor was bombed. He was like 5 years old and was much, much too young to serve. It kind of carried on into my generation, where I dodged a bullet when I signed up for selective service in the 80s when I was in high school. The only conflict back then was Grenada or something like that, and there weren't any real wars until after I was done with college again. But we kind of skipped that. On my mom's side, I had an uncle that served in Vietnam, but it missed my mother, who was older. Not that she would have served, but we kind of got lucky in terms of when everybody was born to have skipped that. But my father had siblings who were a lot older than him. My Auntie Alice, I think, was probably a good 16 years older than he was, or something like that. And her husband, my Uncle Machuk, Mitsugi Nishio, served in the 1399th. As you correctly pointed out, I knew it was an engineering battalion, and you put the number out there, and I said, yes, it was that one. It was the 1399th during World War II. I didn't know much about his service in the 1399th, talking to my auntie and my cousins, but I found out more about it, unfortunately, at his funeral. Uncle Machuk lived to be like 96 or something like that, maybe a little older than that. But as far as my family connection goes, unfortunately, I did not have an opportunity to speak much with my uncle when he was alive about his service, and I
Yeah.
wish I really did.
Yeah. Well, in your book, your characters have ties to internment, as well as fighting in World War II. So how important was that to you to include both of those things in this novel?
Oh, for me, it was very important. I think this novel would not have happened if not for mention of those things. And the reason for that is that I wanted to write a book that I of the type that I enjoyed reading from about late high school to college on, which was the detective fiction of Raymond Chandler. What I had realized in reading Chandler and reading kind of contemporary authors to Chandler, Dashiell Hammett a little before him, and Ross MacDonald a little after him, was that the whole post-war uh, environment was kind of part and parcel to the cynicism that their detectives brought to the page. And it was because America had changed drastically thanks to World War II, and a lot of the disillusionment for servicemen who came back to a country that was changed after their service really affected their thought process. And it's also one of those situations where there was a trade-off of sorts, a trade-off of sacrifice to country, sacrifice of your life and limb for country in exchange for the prosperity that the 1950s brought for the entire United States. And what I realized in writing a detective story uh, set here with a local protagonist is that that's what I had wanted to do. And I think that uh, for the uh, for the Nisei veteran experience, that that exchange or that that trade-off of service for prosperity is more stark than it is elsewhere in the country, because that trade-off came with a lot of other sacrifice that wasn't typical of your typical serviceman. And I think that that's part and parcel to the tone of the book, and that's why I had to include it. It made a much darker book, I think, which was always my intention. The internment thing, although in Hawaii we did not experience internment the way Japanese Americans did on the mainland, it touched a few people here
Right.
in that fashion. And in my personal family history, going back to my personal family history on my mother's side, I had a Hanai great grandfather, a Buddhist a priest, the Reverend Fujio, who was on the list to be shipped off to an internment camp on the mainland. He was one of those dangerous Japanese because he was he was in charge of a Buddhist congregation. But what happened was he caught pneumonia and died on Sand Island before before the ship departed. But I put some of that into my book. This became the story of the protagonist's father, and
Right.
I go into it maybe in a little bit more depth in the second upcoming book coming out this fall, Red Dirt, where he has reminiscences about being on Sand Island with his father while he has pneumonia. But that was also very important to mention. It was important to mention that internment did touch families here,
Mhm.
even though it wasn't like on the mainland where it was an entire population of people who went. Because we were subject to martial law here, and it was a different experience, but it touched a few nonetheless. And
It it
yeah.
sure did,
Mhm.
definitely, as you said, not to the degree of those Japanese American families on the West Coast, but indeed, every island had some sort of internment or holding site. Well, that's interesting to know. And so your character is a returning Nisei veteran. His name is Francis Sheik Yoshikawa, and I wanted to talk about the reason for the nickname of Sheik. Where did that come from?
Well, it was typical, I think, of the time for a lot of Japanese males, Japanese American males, to have nicknames that were based on their names, first or last, first names if they were Japanese first names, and certainly surnames that were shortened quite a bit because they were maybe to a lot of people they were a mouthful. You know, I think of my Polish friends from college who get their names shortened because they're quite a mouthful. The Japanese names were long, especially for Asian names here, 4 syllables sometimes, 5 syllables, and they often got truncated. You know, and so this is typical. Sometimes they'd be truncated to 2 syllables, and often the 1 syllable. So you see a lot of names like Yosh and Hosh and things like that, where they had taken a 4 syllable name and made it like a 1 syllable name. So Sheik was one of those syllables that was in Yoshikawa, but it was it, it's a little tongue-in-cheek reference in a couple of ways. One, I chose it because it was also a pop culture reference, although a period pop culture reference to Rudolph Valentino, which was a few years ago, right? And that's why sometimes he's referred to as the Sheik instead of just Sheik, by mostly by his Howley coworkers. And the other reason is it's a little nod to my course of study in college. I was an Islamic studies major at NYU, which is something that happened really quite by drunken accident, um, but it turned out to be my major, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek nod to that.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, you talked about what you decided to study in college, and and then you go into a career in law enforcement, and we had a really interesting conversation of how actually it is all interconnected. But speaking of what you studied, throughout the book, there are so many references to Dante's Inferno. Um, and could you talk about that a little bit? I mean, do people have to understand Dante's Inferno to understand the book? Does it give them a little extra if they do?
Well, I would hope so and hope not at the same time. I didn't mean for it to be a distraction. Uh, as I said, I was an Islamic studies major quite by accident. I could have almost just as easily been a Russian literature and translation major. But as a minor, I picked up medieval and Renaissance studies because I had courses in Gothic architecture and early Christian theology, in romantic poetic expression of the 13th century and things like that, that I kind of picked up on the side, and a lot of my Islamic studies courses fit right in, and I could like double up on it. But one of the courses I took was in medieval mysticism, and it discussed the Divina Commedia at length. And we looked at, of course, in translation. I don't have any command whatsoever of medieval Italian, but I put those references in there because I thought that giving the protagonist a background where he had taken advantage of GI Bill, just like a lot of the veterans did, and some of them to really prestigious universities. This character ends up at Columbia, which was probably several blocks north of where I actually went to school, and had that course of study. I regretted it a bit, putting in those references to Dante, because I think around the same time that I got the 2-chapter excerpt published, Dan Brown came out with a book Inferno, which was all about Dante's Inferno, and I didn't want anyone to think that I had tried to ride on the coattails of the success of that book. It's not. The references are really kind of. They're a little more sarcastic, but that was on purpose because Dante's Inferno, in the end, is satire, and I think very, very few people understand it. It's not a work that's meant to be devotional, although it does go through the layers of paradise, purgatory, and hell. It is not meant to be theological by any stretch of the imagination. What it's meant to be is satire. That a lot of the people that that Dante kind of skewers by putting them in purgatory and in inferno are really political characters of his time. And I thought that was perfect because this book, Kona Winds, is supposed to be in part satire in a way, a reference to the political climate of the time.
Right. And you know, I think in reference to Dan Brown's book, I think your book stands alone, and
well, thank
it's
you.
wonderful. Yes, maybe he was copying, maybe he was read yours. No, but really, no, it's great. And so you know, that's really interesting. You know, you talk about what was happening in Honolulu at the time, and I think you kind of already answered the question of why pick post World War II Honolulu. You know, that's because of your protagonist, but what was going on in Honolulu at that time, and was what was happening an important character in your book as well?
Yeah, it was very important. I had to pick this era because I think that Hawaii's territorial years are kind of glossed over in popular culture, and they're kind of glossed over in kind of serious academic culture too. I've friends who are professors in the UH system who talk about this a lot of times, and we do fortunately have in the UH system some professors who are emerging and have become experts in the territorial period of Hawaii. The reason I think that's really important for me and for a lot of us is because I think that if you are neither native Hawaiian nor Haole, but you're from Hawaii, our crucible struggle was the territorial years. It was those years after the unlawful overthrow of the monarchy and today's Hawaii that really, really get glossed over. I think there are popular culture references to it because that's about the time where tourism was born in the late 50s with the jet age and bringing people here in droves in an affordable manner for the first time. And that was really kind of post, you know, it was born at the very end of the territorial period, but that was really post statehood by the time that started happening. So people's understanding of those years between the turn of the last century and statehood are really not really well defined. I think that in school, like when I was in elementary age, we had these May Day programs that everybody would dress in their ethnic costumes. I think you're going to see less and less of that. I mean, you probably don't see that anymore because now kids are part a lot of things, right? Like which costume do you wear when you have 4 or 5 different ethnic backgrounds? But back then, when I was younger, we still had quite a few kids who were maybe only of one ethnic background, and they kind of made you wear your ethnic costume during May Day. Probably this happened the years before I was in elementary school too. But I kind of realized later as I was writing my book that this was kind of a glossing over or kind of a whitewashing, if you will, of the plantation experience. It's because a lot of ugly stuff happened on the plantations, on the Big Five plantations, where there was really a divide and conquer strategy, where ethnic groups are kept in different camps. A lot of people will say that was for other convenient reasons, which I can see for language, culture, and that type of thing. But it was also to keep them separate. And they employed a strategy of divide and conquer where they would pay each ethnic group a different scale. You know, the Portuguese were usually the lunas and paid the highest scale. And then you would have this next hierarchy, which include the Chinese. And then the Japanese were paid a little less than that. And then the Filipinos were paid less than the Japanese. And this was to create a resentment between the groups and to prevent them from organizing. And that's what was happening right in the period where I write, is that a lot of these groups had started at this point to put their differences aside and organize. In 1949, there was a major strike which included sugar workers and dock workers. And that strike was organized by the likes of labor leaders like Jack Hall, like the people who become the Hawaii Seven eventually in that Smith Act trial in 1953, which is the subject matter of my second book. But you know, the whole anti-communist thing became very popular here as well as on the mainland, and that was kind of the environment. If the 50s was kind of steeped with this witch hunt mentality at a national level, it was certainly here too, or that's what my research tells me,
Right.
is that was here too. It's just that people don't talk about it today.
Right.
And,
You know,
and
and
yeah.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, and that's what was happening back then, and that's hand in hand with Nisei coming of age as the largest population bloc, and they have U.S. citizenship, and they would become the largest voting bloc of the time.
Yeah.
So we're on the verge of change.
Right. And that's definitely front and center of the book. And someone wrote in and said, please, I'm only halfway through the book. Don't give us any spoilers. So don't worry, we're not giving any spoilers. You know, but it kind of on that same line, I mean, your characters are a melting pot: Japanese American, Caucasian, Korean American, Filipino, Hawaiian. And, you know, I think maybe because of the Aloha spirit, we tend to perhaps think that we don't have classism or racism in Hawaii, but you know, your characters and the book speaks to the fact that there was and is in the book.
Yeah,
Yeah. What do you have to? What about that?
well, I think that's certainly true, and I wanted to portray a lot of that as much as I could in the book, but I wanted to portray the nuance as well. Yes, we did have classism and racism here. We had a labor movement and anti-labor movement here, but I think it took a very different form than it did elsewhere in the United States. Uh, in a way, some might say it was gentler because it was a lot more subtle, but in a lot of ways it was a lot more insidious as well. Uh, you know, we're on an island. It's a very small place, or islands, I should say, which are very small places where everybody knows everybody else. So conflicts and things, confrontations that break out between people are going to be less common than they would be in a bigger place like the mainland, where you can remain relatively anonymous. We don't have that kind of a history of open confrontation, although there have been isolated incidents of that, and that's like a topic for another book. But
Right.
yeah, but yeah, I think that what I wanted to explore was that there is an ethnic dynamic here. I tried to portray, like say for example, the Howley group I try to portray is that there is a patrician landowning elite that was Howley, but there was also a population, a Howley population that was not elite, that came with the war, not just to serve, but to work in the shipyards of Pearl Harbor. And to provide that labor that was needed. And I think World War II was really a turning point in what shaped a lot of what we know as Hawaii today. One of the startling things I learned, probably you folks on Maui who have lived through all this can confirm this, is that all the islands at one point were on equal political, more or less, and economic footing. The ads in the Hawaii Record of the 1950s were crammed with Japanese-owned florist ads from Hilo, and that's because they were more or less still on fairly equal political footing, although they were giving way economically to Oahu. But Oahu became that hyper center of commerce and everything post World War II. And that's because the wartime economy made it so. That's because there was a population boom during the war when we needed that labor on Oahu, at Pearl Harbor, and places like that for the war effort. but that also brought a different migration of haoles that set up residence here that were different from the landowning elite. And that's part of that is embodying the character of Jack Morris,
Right.
one of his detective friends,
Yeah.
who was of a different class. And a lot of people don't realize that. When I say a lot of people outside of Hawaii don't realize that, is that it wasn't kind of just one block
True.
of white people that just dominated everything. And you know, a lot of people have said that Ellen Park is their favorite character, and the evolution of that character is something that it's kind of an interesting story. But one of the things is I didn't know I was going to make her Korean until I talked to a Korean friend of mine who had read my manuscript. My friend Sarah Matos, I don't know if she's here, but I worked with Sarah at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection before she had moved away and retired with her family on the mainland. And she's Korean, and she's the one that while reading the manuscript had suggested, why don't you just make her Korean? Because I had considered different things. I knew I did not want to make her Japanese like the protagonist, because this was a time where outmarriage of that population had started to happen. And I think that a lot of the Nisei veterans led the way in this because they had been exposed to Europe. They had been exposed to mainland colleges on the GI Bill, and they came back with a different mindset. So this was a guy, if any, who might consider dating somebody who wasn't of the same background. And at first, you know, she was haole, and she was like a Hawaiian at first, and she was many other things. But when I was given the suggestion of Korean, I thought, well, you know, this is interesting because the Korean population here had an interesting history at the time. They were very small. They were like a little over 5,000, I think, at the time. But it created a lot of interesting circumstances for that community. And it was a community of Koreans who had migrated before 1924, when the laws had changed. 1924 was that act of Congress that excluded Japanese and Koreans. It was kind of like a follow-up to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
And it wasn't until 52 that those things were rescinded and Asian migration could begin again to the United States. But those Korean immigrants that came over knew a Korea that was occupied by Japan. And you know, they were bilingual in both Korean and Japanese. As a result, there was a lot of resentment, naturally. But it made for an interesting population, an interesting background. So I wanted to include some of that. These are things I like doing, is like these little known things to people today or on the mainland, where I can put these things in and maybe encourage some further reading on it.
Yeah, well, I couldn't imagine her as any other ethnicity, and it's great just to see her grow throughout the book. So very interesting. So, you know, when I was reading the book, it felt very Raymond Chandler to me.
Oh, thank
you
you.
know, I was thinking Bogart and Bacall and The Big Sleep, but then I would read your local descriptions, such as, and the food, you put so much food in this novel, it really made me hungry. But you were talking, you said the sun had started to sink and set fire to clouds as thick as mayonnaise in an Okazuya tuna sandwich. I mean, so as soon as I was thinking Raymond Chandler, this brought me back home. And then the other one that I just loved was your description of this woman. She was cute in a demure Japanese Mikiki church bake sale sort of way. And I mean, those are only descriptions that you could use in Hawaii. And I love them. They're wonderful. I mean, so if people haven't read the book, they have to read the book just for all the descriptions that you give to people.
Well, thank you. And you know, those descriptions are really just a riff on Chandler. You know, he was a master of using similes like that. But all I did was put a local bent on them.
Wow, it's great. So do you want to do a little, can you do a reading for us?
Sure.
Okay.
What I'll do, and I've decided I'm going to read a couple of passages, but they're very, very short. And the reason I decided to read two of them is one to give you a sense of the dialogue in the book, and the other to give you a sense of the monologue, because I think in a lot of detective fiction, both are very, very important. The tone is very important for both. But they're very short, so I'll give you a reading for a sample of the dialogue first, and then for the monologue. So here's a sample of the dialogue, and I'm going to do this in what I call detective monotone because that's the way I wrote it in. I had a wonderful review in the International Examiner, and somebody said, "Well, if you can get past the Joe Friday like monotone," and I thought, well, that's a compliment to me because that's how I really envisioned this thing was going to be read. But that's how I do the reading. And by the way, a lot of the people I work with talk this way, so it's realistic in that sense. Robert's a dirty little tire place just off Queen Street, a couple of blocks away from the territorial office building and about 4 blocks away from Kasang's Pink House in the opposite direction, had a fenced-in yard piled high with tires, old and new. Pushed off to the side, a single dying coconut palm and an oil drum looked as if it were used to block the driveway after closing time. A mean little shop. Because it looked like shit, one might go there for a better deal on a set of white walls, but later find out that the grubby little proprietor, who was a drunk, who would take every proper opportunity to gouge you for every penny. I parked across the street and tread cautiously past the sorry palm and over the grease-stained concrete to the shack with plywood walls and a corrugated tin roof. The hand-painted plaque on the shabby door said office, as if to say, yeah, you've come to the right place, even though it looks like a condemned tool shed. At least the sign was spelled correctly. I knocked and heard a cough and some unpleasant hacking before a voice said, "Come in." It sounded like someone was dying. I opened the door and was immediately hit in the face with the odor of rot-gut rye and stale cold sweat, like a jacket that hadn't seen a cleaner in 5 years. A hint of reefer smoke and something rotten I couldn't identify also lingered in the air. A hunchbacked old howly man with a grubby work shirt sat at a desk piled high with carbon invoices and dog-eared catalogs from various tire manufacturers. His open work shirt revealed a yellow undershirt damp with sweat and a dull St. Christopher medal dangling from a cheap chain. He looked as if he hadn't shaved or bathed in 3 days and was intently studying an order form under the sick yellow light of an army surplus desk lamp while taking sips of rye spiked coffee from a dirty mug. Yeah, he grunted without looking at me. The office sweltered like the gym locker room at McKinley, only 10 times hotter and without the smell of soap. Perspiration began to pour down the side of my face. Are you the Robert of Robert's Tire? So my mother named me, yeah. You want some tires, rotation? We do those too, but only on Wednesdays when the part-time boys come in. Robert put his mug down and stood slowly, careful not to knock the tiny droning fan off his desk, which was about as helpful at cooling down the shed as a crack in the window pane. That your caddy out there? He asked as he peered through the dirty window, sudden life in his haggard voice. Want a set of white walls? Sure would look nice. Thanks, but I'm here on business. I flashed the badge and his eyes shot out of their sockets. Hey, look, I told that lady there weren't no refunds on the set. All sales final. I told her and she said, yeah, like she knew what I said. Not here about that. Well, shit, I don't know where those part-time boys get their reefers from, but I told them if I caught them smoking that shit around here, they're all fired. All of them. Not here about that either. I don't know. I didn't know that girl was only 16. You know those Japs, they all look so damn young anyway. Not this Jap, I said. This Jap grows old with every misdemeanor you insist on confessing. Not here to talk to you, Robert. I want to talk to Albert Ishida. Is he here? Albert? My bookkeeper? Yeah, he's out back doing inventory. I'll take you. Robert smiled that goofy, irrepressible grin and let out that involuntary chuckle that were the hallmarks of a guy off the hook. He led me out of his sweltering office to the covered shop and into the rear stock area of his lot. So that kind of gives you an idea of the dialogue. You know, I hope the cadence follows some of what inspired it, which was Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett.
Yeah, definitely. We got a couple of people wrote in and just said Dana, she said she loved the line that said, he leaned on his putter like Mr. Peanut leaned on his walking stick. She said, great imagery. And Carol's wondering what pages you were reading from so that she can.
Okay. That one. Oops. That one's at the beginning of chapter 7, which is page 63.
Okay.
And it goes into page 64.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And you know, your character in the book talks about the importance of smoking cigars and reading the newspaper every day, cover to cover. And so I'm wondering how much of that is Scott Kikkawa and how much of that kind of stuff is, you know, things that are not necessarily, maybe more fiction. Well, do you read the newspaper every day from cover to cover, and do you smoke cigars when you have to go out?
Well, the answer in order is no and yes. I don't read the newspaper cover to cover. I get, because I supervise an intelligence unit at work, we get our daily news from a different source, and it's more international. And I try to keep up on the local stuff too, but it's all kind of online now. So it's lost a bit of the romanticism of going through the paper cover to cover. Although I've known, I've had mentors in law enforcement that have done exactly that. The cigars, yeah, I do smoke them. I'm more of a pipe smoker though than a cigar smoker. I'm something of a throwback. So a lot of the stuff that comes up are actually things that I enjoy. They were enjoyed during the period, but I also enjoy them. Whiskey is one of them. Although I had to kind of resist the temptation of putting my own personal favorite scotches into the book because they simply didn't exist in the American market back in the 1950s. In the 50s, America was all about blended scotch. So things like the Hagen Hague and Chivas Regal and Johnny Walker were kind of the order of the day, and single malt scotches were barely existent in the United States. In fact, they were kind of only in the UK and Europe back then. It wasn't until the 1970s that we kind of got a hint of a single malt in America, and then it kind of took off in the late 80s and the early 90s. But a lot of those habits in there are things that that are my own bad habits, including the clothes too. Yeah, I love the clothes of that era.
I do
yeah.
too. I hear you on that one. You know, but in the book too, you say that, you know, contrary to what most people believe, detective work is not made up of interviewing sobbing witnesses or chasing down suspects in dramatic fashion. Instead, 50% of the time is doing research. Is that true? Is that true with you know, crime in your job today?
Yes, that is very true, actually. A lot of what a detective did in the 1950s is something that we do today still, but we do it in a different fashion. So a lot of what a detective is out there doing is research of a sort. He's trying to gather information. He's got to go to the bank and talk to the manager to get access to that account. He's got to go to the Hall of Records to pull a marriage certificate or a birth certificate or a death certificate. And getting that information is usually about doing very human things. It's about doing things like threatening people or flirting with people or bribing people in order to get that information, because the lines are so long at places like that. And that was a reality back in the 1950s. That's most of what a detective did, was gathering that kind of information. Today, we don't do that. We do that from our desks. You know, that it's all online today. And a lot of what my unit does is that type of research. We're just not standing in line at the Bureau of Conveyances or at a bank with a subpoena in hand. We are checking. We're checking their records on the computer, and that's how detective work has changed a great deal.
So
Yeah.
could you have written this book in today's landscape?
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, I always tell people that I think there was a golden age of crime and crime fiction, and it is not today. This is with apologies to my many friends who write contemporary crime fiction. It's all great, but coming from the field of law enforcement, I always find I have to suspend my disbelief just a little when I read contemporarily set crime fiction, because we live in an age of advanced forensic science, and we live in an age of litigation. Those things have changed law enforcement work drastically, and have made a lot of what we do a lot less like what you are used to reading in books. I think a lot less interesting, in my opinion.
Has crime changed?
Crime has changed to a certain extent, I believe. Back then, you know, people used to kill each other over things like cash. Nobody does that anymore. It's almost as if cash doesn't have any value anymore. But things like that used to happen. There used to be cases of mistaken identity before the age of DNA and the age of biometrics. There used to be a lot of mistaken identity. Before the age of litigation, cops used to routinely, and probably it still happens here and there, used to routinely beat confessions out of their suspects. And I'm not saying that all that is great. I'm not saying that I yearn for that era. I certainly do not. I am very happy I don't work in that environment. But I think they make more interesting stories. I think that the stories that came out of that era are certainly more interesting. And maybe that's a personal prejudice of mine, because I certainly don't think that anything I do for a paycheck is interesting at all. I don't think anybody would want to read about it.
Well, that leads me to asking you, because you talk about the golden age of crime. Do you have a favorite crime movie?
Yes, that movie is Double Indemnity. I think that that probably was 1944, I think, or it was squarely during the war years. But this is Billy Wilder's interpretation of James M. Cain's novel. Some would call it a novelette, because it's very, very thin. It doesn't have a high word count. James M. Cain was probably one of the big three American noir authors of the time, along with Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. James Cain did not write detective fiction, but he wrote stories which are more commonly probably identified as noir today, which are about kind of real life loser type characters that kind of get caught up in a downward swirl of events after they've been after they've gotten a whiff of a better life, and chasing that by illegal means. But Double Indemnity was based on a James M. Cain novel, but the screenplay was by Wilder and by Raymond Chandler. Raymond Chandler actually has a cameo in Double Indemnity.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I love that movie. When,
yeah,
Barbara Stanwyck comes down the stairs.
Yeah, on the stairs. Yeah. And they talk about her ankle bracelet, and
Yes.
all that dialogue is Raymond Chandler. How fast was I going, officer?
Really?
Yeah, that was all Raymond Chandler. The timing is pure Chandler. That was my favorite part of the movie, by the way, is that dialogue between Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck about like during his first visit. But yeah, Raymond Chandler is a cameo in that
Really?
production, where Fred McMurray walks into Edward G. Robinson's office,
Right.
and there's a man waiting on a bench outside of the office. That's Raymond Chandler.
I know what I'm going to do when I go home tonight.
Yeah, he's only there for like 2 seconds. If you blink, you'll miss it. But that was his cameo. But it's a wonderful movie. It's shot in that black and white chiaroscuro lighting. One of the originals where the Venetian blinds were used to cast kind of like bars over the faces of the actors, as if to suggest prison or doom. It's I think it's textbook noir. It's the best film noir ever made. So that is my favorite movie.
Okay, what about TV show? What about crime TV show? I mean, are we talking Dragnet? Adam 12?
Yeah, Dragnet, absolutely. And it is. I think all TV crime is kind of goofy in a way. It's not indicative of how things really are in real life by any stretch of the imagination. But Dragnet had so much style. Jack Webb and his monotone, I think, set the pace. The gray suits, the hats, and the California of the time is really captured in Dragnet. And I'm something of a throwback there. If you ask me what the best police show ever made is, it's always going to be Dragnet.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
A couple of people asked us before this started, what exactly is noir? How do you, Scott Kikkawa, define noir?
Well, it's one of those things where scholars split hairs over it. And noir has a general blanket term, which would include things like Chandler, which would include maybe my book. I'm flattered when people refer to it as noir because it's my favorite genre. But there are those people who say, or the hardliners who say noir is really about doom. It's really about no optimism with the human condition. And it's usually French critics that say this, right? It's their word after all. But James M. Cain, Double Indemnity, Postman Always Rings Twice. Those are books which they would call actually pure noir. Things like Chandler and Hammett is a term they use often with that as hard boiled, and what that is a subgenre of mystery. Hard boiled is the dialogue, is the feel, is the plot turn in the description. So a lot of people would say, no, his work is not noir, it's hard-boiled, but noir is a blanket term that's used to describe a lot of detective fiction of the time, which is bleaker and doesn't always have a happy ending. I think that's kind of or not a happy ending in the sense that most people come to think of as a happy ending or a neat ending. Those are more in traditional mysteries, things like Agatha Christie, and mysteries that are modeled after that, where there's always a neat solution and resolution, and the culprits are brought to justice. This does not always happen in noir. And in the case of my book, without giving any spoilers, I will leave you to decide whether or not that ending is something that you think is a happy ending or is one that makes any sense.
So, without giving anything away, does Frank Yoshikawa, your protagonist, have an act 2? You're talking about your next book, and we would love to get you over here in person, perhaps in the new year.
I'd love to come.
When you debut it. But is Frank going to be in it? Can you tell us that much?
Yes, he is a protagonist in the second book called Red Dirt, which is coming out. Bamboo Ridge is releasing it, I think, in fall of this year. I don't know. I've heard a month thrown out, October or November. But it takes place a few weeks after the events of Kona Winds. And it starts with bones being found charred and hacked up in the middle of a cane field in Kunia. And our detective inherits a case, and it's set against a backdrop of the Hawaii 7 trial, which came to a resolution in the summer of 1953. So the Hawaii 7 are those that were up on Smith Act charges, plotting the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, as it were, communists. And this was Jack Hall, this was John Reinecke, this was Koji Ariyoshi, you know, and it was one of those sensational things that was happening right here at the time. And again, this is one of those things that nobody ever talks about today, or nobody that I know who's lived through it had ever mentioned it as I was growing up. But I think it was kind of a pivotal moment in territorial history, and I incorporated the plot as well I could into the events of the Hawaii 7 trial, and that's red dirt. I was informed by Bamboo Ridge. I'm extremely lucky that there will be a third book as well, same protagonist, and that is in. I think that's slated for 2023.
Wow! Congratulations.
Thank you. That's yeah. That one is titled Charshu. That it's set in Chinatown, and is inspired by the real life HPD kickback scandals of the gambling dens there.
Oh, very exciting. We look forward to those. We are gently coming to the end of our hour. I'm going to just let people know what's coming up, and then I'm going to come back to you, Scott, for some closing remarks. But for those who haven't read the book yet, if you're interested in it, we do have just a handful of signed copies left available here at the office, so you can email us or give us a call if you'd like to get your copy. Again, it is signed. If you're new to Noir, it's a lovely introduction. If you like history, you will love this. If you like detective novels, you will love this. It's really just an all-around great book, great read. And next month for our afternoon with the author, we are going to be talking with Naomi Hirahara. She is the author of the Moss Arai novels, but she also is coming out with a new book called Clark and Division in August. And we'll be talking to her in July. So that'll be the third Saturday of July. You can check out all of our previous talks on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and then type in Nisei Veterans Memorial Center. And you can also go to our website at nvmc.org to sign up for upcoming talks. Little by little, we're starting to reopen and do some things in person, some workshops and things like that. So for those of you who are on Maui, we hope that you sign up for some and come and spend an afternoon with us. But I'd like to go back to you, Scott, for some closing remarks. First of all, I just want to thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and thank the viewing audience out there as well. But close us out.
Well, yeah, and thank you for having me, Deidre. This is a wonderful format and platform. Wow, and Naomi Hirahara, you know, she's a friend of mine, and she's like my patron saint. She's like the godmother of all Asian American mystery writers, and she has really done a lot to promote my work on the mainland. But closing remarks, you know, I was talking with you earlier before we kind of got on with everybody else about some of the things folks have said about my book. And I have an uncle, Dr. Iwao Shiraki, I don't think he's on today, who told me that he enjoyed the book very much. And he said, we finally have a book about us. And I think that's the highest compliment I've been paid by anyone, because it's something that came from someone who lived through the events. And what he was essentially telling me is that I got it right. That means everything to me. A lot of research went into this. Photo archives, online research. I think I must have read about 7 books. And I also had access, thanks to Dr. Bill Pewitt at the UH West Oahu, to the CLEAR library, the Center for Labor Education and Research. He actually allowed me in to the CLEAR collection, where I got to look at things and handle things. I feel a little bad I didn't have the white gloves, but now I got to handle handwritten pages of a legal paper by John Reinecke, his notes, things like Jack Hall's minutes from the ILWU meetings back in the 1950s. It really, really gave me a sense of what the period was like, and being in the period. You know, I didn't strive to write an identity book. That's one of the things that has always, and I'm sorry to say this, has irritated me about what they call Asian American literature, is that a lot of it had been about identity. A lot of it had been about the suffering, about the trials of somebody in that experience. I just wanted to write a book about a regular guy, but a guy that was maybe like me or like somebody I knew, and this was the result. It wasn't meant to be a statement book, but it has turned into one in a way, and I think maybe I'm very fortunate in that people perceive it to be many things, and they get out of it what they can. And I'm really lucky because in my mind, all I did was write a detective story, and it's come to mean other things to other people.
Well, I think that's the beauty of what you've written. It means so much to so many, and we thank you. Your time with us this afternoon really means a lot to us, and we look forward to Red Dirt and Char Siu, and hopefully can get you out here to Maui one of these days, and people can meet you in person. But until then, we just want to thank you so much. Thank you to the audience today. We appreciate it. Take care. Have a good week. And until next time, ahui ho.
Thank you, Deidre. Thank you, everybody.